This is an emergency meeting. I am calling a meeting to talk to you today about feature flags. Obviously, this is the HackerNoon podcast, and my name is Amy Tom. What a delightful June day that we are on today. And today, I also am going to introduce you to the solutions architect for LaunchDarkly. It is Yoz Grahame.
Hello.
Graham, is that how you pronounce your last name? We didn't discuss this before. Great.
That's fine. That's great.
Amazing.
I'm a solutions architect. There are multiple solutions. We come in six packs.
Yes, so, and you have also been a dev, a program manager, and a field researcher. So a lot of different hats that you've worn. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this first to start. When did you start your career in tech?
Oh, that would have been, my God. I think my uncle paid me to do some software for him when I was like 15. It was a university time when I was like 19, I think, and this was in 1993 or 1994, started doing phone tech support. So many of us in the industry have started in tech support, and I'm no exception. Phone tech support for a company that was verging into internet, dial-up bulletin board system called Delphi in the UK or Delphi in the US. This may ring some bells to people. Have you ever heard of Delphi?
No, but I like that it's different from the UK to the US.
The pronunciation, we all called it Delphi in the UK. It's all so it's like it goes along with like CompuServe and Prodigy, and I don't know if you've heard any of those names from the distant past, but it was dial-up internet or something resembling internet. And forums and things, and they would occasionally let you out onto the wider web.
And what did you go to university for?
Computer science, I'm afraid. And I think, this is a time to point out that if you are choosing, the advice I give to people is if you want to go into tech, then do something else in university, not computer science. I mean, it's a great way to get a leg up in certain things. But what I've found is that the most interesting stuff I've discovered in tech has come from people who've come from other disciplines. I really regret the fact that I don't have a broader education, especially in things like liberal arts, because being able to write well and communicate well is such a good long-term skill. And, it's the kind of thing that doesn't really age, whereas, computing ages while you're in the middle of learning it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think I've ever heard anyone tell me that before.
Really?
But yeah, I think you make a good point, because I guess computer science is something nowadays that's easy to learn on your own, like coding or whatever vertical you want to go into. And I guess writing is easy to learn on your own too. You just have to practice.
It can be. I think college, there's something. I went to university in the UK. This may be obvious from my accent. But in the UK, there's much more specialization early on, right? In that when you do a degree in the UK, like 90% of your courses are in your major. Whereas in the US, it's much more like 50%, it seems like.
Okay, yeah.
Something like that. And so I really did not get a good diverse education at all. I think in the US, it makes more sense to focus on computer science because you're going to get an opportunity to do all these other... Yeah. And people go on a lot about the importance of computer science in programming. And I'm not so much of... I think it's good to have a grounding in some of the principles, but it turns out that there's an awful lot of it that you don't really learn well that is useful, or a whole load of stuff that you learn that isn't actually as useful as it might be.
Are you pro education in general, or do you think that people don't need degrees?
Oh, no, that's a really good question. I think there's certainly too much emphasis on degrees. I think that it's great to be able to spend time in a concentrated learning environment, right? And to have focused on learning, and to be able to get to have time to devote to learning, as opposed to being thrown out into the world of work, right? But I think that the emphasis on degrees, especially places like Google, that
oh yes,
that had this thing for ages. A friend of mine, I believe, was the first engineer hired by them who didn't have a computer science degree or didn't have any degree at all, actually. And it certainly didn't stop him from, fortunately, didn't stop him from getting really high up in part of the organization. I think it's interesting having conversation with someone earlier just before this about, as you become a more experienced engineer, you realize that code is less important in the greater scheme of things than communication and how you deal with people. That becomes much more important. And the way I think about it is well-documented code that doesn't work is much easier to change than undocumented code that does work. And I've had to look after both, right? It's like, the trouble is, undocumented code that does work, you're petrified of changing it.
Yeah.
Because you've no idea why it works the way it does, and code that is well documented and has tests, especially. Tests are brilliant, but they're no replacement for documentation. If it doesn't work, you have a much better idea of how to fix it. And it's code that is going to last much better. And so I think that applies generally to communication overall. You realize, as you become a more experienced engineer, that it is your ability to communicate ideas to others. You can have the best ideas in the world. You can be a complete genius when it comes to code. But if you can't get the rest of your team on board, if you can't get people to work with you well on it, then there's no point, right? Yeah. And this is, I think, how I think the importance of things like codes of conduct and things like that.
Yes.
Is that it is so much more important to be able to work together well and bring in more people than it is to try and be an individual rock star who...
It kind of comes to like hard skills and soft skills too. Hard skill, coding is a hard skill. Anybody can learn to code.
Right.
And anybody can master the skill. And a soft skill kind of relates a little to your personality, it relates to your experiences. And is harder to master because it's less tangible, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, it's certainly less tangible. It's, there's, with programming, you get a compiler error. If you've done it wrong, most of the time, if you've done it, there's a whole load of other errors you won't get. And this gets into the world of bugs, which I think we're saving for a later episode. But it's much harder to diagnose where you're going wrong in your socio-technical skills, as people like to call them, or soft skills. And the trouble with calling them soft skills, it makes it sound like they're less important.
That's
somehow
true.
The word, I don't know, I don't know if people treat it that way, but socio-technical skills are absolutely vital. And there's actually a colleague of mine, Dawn Parzic, who is she leads developer relations at LaunchDarkly, has a great talk about this that I recommend looking up online, about developing socio-technical skills, and has tips for how to do it. If you think you've got problems in how you're communicating, if you're having trouble, getting people on side, or also things like empathy, being able to empathize well with a team is so vital, and it's something that you work on all your life.
Yeah, that's true. Those skills are super important. I feel almost like I have an abundance of those skills and not as much hard skill or technical knowledge. And this is because too, maybe I went to technical school for marketing. So I kind of came up through the other side of what you're talking about with the like more writing and creative aspects to tech. And then I went into tech afterwards. So I almost feel, though, like I wish that I had a bit of more computer science schooling knowledge, because I didn't learn. I took like one web development course or something. That's like the extent of my programming knowledge, coding knowledge, and I kind of wish that I had more of that.
Yeah. I can definitely understand wanting to have more of that, and I think it's not easy to learn. I think there I think they've actually proven this to a degree. There've been some really interesting studies about how there are some basic aspects of programming that certain people have real difficulty picking up. Or some groups of people have real difficulty picking up. Honestly, I see that more as a condemnation of programming than condemnation of people. As I get older and I get more grumpy around everything, especially technology, I despair when I see people thinking that they are bad at technology when in fact technology is bad at them. You know, that's how I like to think about it, is that
I don't think I'm bad at technology per se. I think I'm actually pretty technically savvy. I think that coding though is like a bit of a beast to me. It's a little intimidating.
It's a beast to people who are really experienced at it. It's the complexity of it these days. It unfortunately, most of our, like, it's a very young science still. There's very little advice in it that hasn't been completely upended in the past 20 years, or there isn't still huge debate about.
Right.
You know, the number of...
So how did you learn?
I got very interested somehow when I was, 5 or 6. I was always interested in computers. I was always interested in playing games on them, but also my dad... I remember my grandfather also, he bought an Apple II, and my dad bought a Sinclair ZX80 for the Brits in the audience who, this was like the original 1 kilobyte of memory, black and white screen, this little white and blue thing that had a flimsy, tiny keyboard that you had to press hard on each button. And so I learned basic programming through it. And it's the kind of thing, I think there's something that's really important to learn these days. In that I don't think coding, I think we push coding as a skill too much, in that I don't think necessarily learning to code itself, learning how to write software or the ability to write software is, I need to differentiate this. I don't think your ability to write, say, a Python program or whatever is necessarily that useful. What is really useful, I think it teaches you, is what I think of as automation literacy, right? Which is the idea that certain things can be automated in certain ways, right? In that, an example I think of is that my then girlfriend, this was like 20 years ago or 15 years ago, she got a temping job at a real estate agent. And they had brought her in because they had a spreadsheet of literally 6,000 properties. And the spreadsheet had each property name and a URL for where on the web the information about this property. And her job for the next 6 weeks was to go through that spreadsheet line by line, click on each link, and then copy information from the same page that were all in the same format into this spreadsheet for 6 weeks. Right. So she brought this home and showed this to me because she knew. She's going, can you do this? And I said, sure. And, a major Perl hacker at the time, the Perl programming language, which is great for slicing and dicing data. And so she brought in the completed spreadsheet the next day. And they're going, we wanted you to do this for 6 weeks and you've done it overnight. What else can you do? Right. But the idea, what got me was that people don't realize that something that is that regimented can be automated, and that you could get somebody to basically write a script in an hour that would do 6 weeks of work, right? And so learning that is possible, and the different ways that the things that you can do with data. I don't think you need to be able to necessarily write code, but to understand what's possible with code and what's difficult is really valuable.
And that is what differentiates people who are junior versus people who are senior, because senior people have more experiences to pull on to know these kinds of things, whereas junior people only have the theory. So I think that makes sense too. So a little birdie told me that you worked on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That little birdie was you.
Yes, we're in conversation, things we're talking about. It's like, oh, Hitchhiker, I did things. What else can I tell you about? I worked in the late 90s, I worked for a company called The Digital Village. that had as its creative director Douglas Adams, who was the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and various other things. And we produced a video game called Starship Titanic that he co-designed and even wrote bits of and wrote music for and starred in. His voice is in it in various places. It's a fun kind of click around puzzle game that has you can find it on, you know, it's actually available again on Steam or something for like $3 usually, or GOG. And it's a fun game. It's, you know, it's got good jokes in it. I also worked on something called H2G2, which is still going, which is the online Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is a website. And we wanted it to be a kind of fun repository of all knowledge that we would do, you know, that anybody could edit through a convoluted editing process. And then a couple of years later, this thing called Wikipedia came along. And it's, you know, we like to think of ourselves as the story
the original
of Hitchhikers. In the story of Hitchhikers, there's the Encyclopedia Galactica, and this is which is the much more authoritative, serious version. Whereas Hitchhikers is the Hitchhiker's Guide in the story is much sillier. But I worked on that, and then I got to help out with the movie a little bit in 2005 and go on set, which was fun.
Wait, what did you do?
It was so small. It was, I got to help out with writing bits of associated copy for some of the fun websites that we did. Like we did a website for selling towels, universal towels. And I actually wrote some guide entries that were read out by Stephen Fry and were only available on iTunes. That I've still got somewhere. They were fun. But yeah, I'm very, very distantly associated. I really don't want to play it up too much, apart from telling everybody
content creation, essentially.
You know, little bits. But it was fun going on set. It was fun really seeing the amazing process of making a movie and the incredible work that people were putting in. It's a movie that Hitchhikers fans have very differing opinions about. For good reason, because it tries to cram a non-movie shaped story into a movie, and it suffers somewhat because of that. But that was lots of fun to work on and to do, and
so
to work
with the late 90s?
With Douglas. Yes, so most of this was in the late 90s, and it also got me somehow into working on a TV show called The IT Crowd, which I worked on the first season of. And if some geeks may know it as a very geeky show. You know, it's fun being involved in random things here and there.
Yes. You seem like you love random projects.
Oh God, yes. And this is, you know, I think a big part of my maturing as a human being and as an adult has been learning to say no to things. You know, I don't do it nearly enough. And so there's wonderful things like I'm hugely privileged in a whole ton of ways. Let's face it, I need to admit this straight off. I got hugely lucky in being in the right place at the right time, and for many of these things. I think it helps, you know, to put yourself out there a lot and do things, but obviously this is much easier for some people than others for a whole bunch of reasons. And so I have copious amounts of privilege that I have wasted on things, but it's been great to learn a bunch. Sorry.
Thank you for acknowledging that. I think that's great. But I also wanted to ask, because I think that the idea of like switching projects constantly is a very like millennial thing to do. And millennials are often looked down upon for not being like loyal to a company in terms of working. So did you have any experiences around people who were like, oh, you've worked on too many things, like you've gone too many places?
Fortunately not. Fortunately, most of the places I've worked, I mean, when I say I've been hugely lucky, I really can't understate this. I think there's been so many ways in which I've been incredibly lucky. Most of the jobs that I've got have come through knowing people or get, and that's to say that I got the job that I think I think I met the criteria they wanted, but certainly it helped to be introduced via people. And it's fortunately also the thing about being in startup world, which I have spent most of my life in, is that this kind of a year here, a year there is common to see. Fortunately, also, there's been enough periods where I've been with the same place for 3-4 years, So I think if everything had been a year or less, that might have been a problem. And I think also, it is hugely valuable to spend time at an organization for at least 3 years, because there are things that you learn about how organizations change. And sometimes that can be really disheartening, right? Most organizations, I'm serious, no, it really can.
No, I know.
I'm
laughing because it hurts.
Right. There are plenty of ways in which you see an organization change as it gets older, and some of the principles and values that you really treasured don't seem to be applied in the same way, or things, and being able to recognize that as a common situation, but also being able to diagnose when something is changing in understandable ways and when something is changing in a way that, no, you should get out of here. This is a bad sign. Right.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, until you get that experience of having been at a couple of organizations for a few years, it's hard to compare. Otherwise, every kind of change feels scary.
Yes, I'm scared of organizational change, but I feel like I've been burned a few times.
Oh, I think so many of us have, and I think especially these days, I think organizations, especially right now, should be doing far more to earn worker loyalty than the other way around.
Right? Shouldn't it fall on the company to keep their employees rather than me feeling like I constantly need to leave?
Right, exactly. It's kind of if workers aren't feeling particularly loyal to the organization, and that's a common thing, then the constant in this is the organization itself. And maybe it should look at itself as the bad partner in the equation.
Well, that's just to say, I would like to clarify that I love working at HackerNoon.
Of course, yes, and it's a wonderful organization, and honestly, I really admire what I've seen. It has been one of the sites that I continually come back to, and when I see that a blog post comes up in my feed or whatever is a HackerNoon post, I'm more likely to read it. I really appreciate the quality of what I see.
Oh, that makes me so happy. And I think, too, I'm not even joking, this is actually the first job that I've ever really, truly loved, I think.
Excellent.
And I think it's also has to do with the startup culture. Is this what your experience has been like? Because I have never worked at a true startup before, but I feel that the people who work at HackerNoon bleed HackerNoon. We love it. We're obsessed. Is that something that's common in the startup world?
Yeah. I think so. Okay. And in fact, I don't even think it's necessarily just startup. I think there are, you'll find ancient organizations that the people there effectively bleed the organization, which is a kind of interestingly worrying way of putting it, but I completely agree. Right. It literally gets into your circulatory system.
Yeah.
Right. It affects all parts of you. And you've really got to temper that, right? You've got to, I think part of the problems that happen with loyalty is that we may expect too much in both directions,
Yeah.
It is so important. And it's tough because we get pushed to do things that we are passionate about for work, right? Saying the work that your work should be your passion. It is also hugely valuable to be able to take a break from it. It's so valuable to be able to, at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., put it down and not care, right? Because the organization is not going to care about you. Some of them do in certain ways. Some organizations have gone above and beyond for me in ways that I'm hugely grateful. And when that has happened, I have done my best to do the same in return. So that does happen. I think it's... but part of it is not just about not giving the organization something it doesn't deserve. It's also about looking after yourself, right? Your own mental health and your ability to be there for the organization is dependent on you not tying your entire identity to it.
Yes. So as someone who's switched projects multiple times, how do you decide to say yes or no?
That's a really good question.
Because you also mentioned that you're getting better at saying no. So how do you decide when you're going to say yes to a project or when you're going to pass?
I think, firstly, this is something I'm still really bad at. I think,
okay.
I say that because I think it's very easy to be aspirational and say, oh, that's something I'd love to be involved with. Oh, that's something I'd like to be involved with as well. And
I'm so bad at that. I love to put my hands in all the pots, and then I'm like, I'm here and I'm everywhere.
Yep. I am Mr. Pie Fingers as well, like all the pies, and unfortunately, you see what happens, which is that you can give half an hour to each one, and in the end, it happens not in the way that you wanted to, or it happens without you, effectively. That you look at it and go, that wasn't at the level of involvement that I wanted.
Yes.
And so,
or you burn out eventually.
There was an algorithm, effectively, or a heuristic that one of my old bosses, Robbie Stout, actually at Digital Village, the way he used to think about it was kind of a point score, or someone else, I can't remember who did this, but there's like the thing you're most involved in gets 13 points. Something that you're half-time involved in gets 8 points.
Okay.
Something that you're, slightly involved in gets 5 points, and you have a total of like 21 points, right? Which means that you can't have something that you're full-time and half-time on. 13 plus 8 is 22, so you can't do that. And think about also. I think about one of the ways that I temper myself is what's some level of realism about what's actually going to happen. What are the failure cases here? What is likely to happen if I don't give this the attention it needs? Right? How badly will it fail? Is it just that I won't be as involved as I wanted to, or is it that I will let the project down? I'll let everybody down. And it's easy, unfortunately, when you're in a depressive mode to undersell yourself and to think that and don't do that, right? But do be realistic and make sure that you have all the right intentions. And I'm involved in way too many things. And
yes, are you a side project too? Like, do you start your own side project?
I do at work. I do.
Okay, yeah.
In my private life, I'm sadly going through a phase which I regret, which is that I don't really have time for my own side projects. Just because of these days, being in my late 40s now, it comes to the end of the day and it's like, I want to sit on the couch and play video games or watch TV or be with my partner, and or my kids. Parenting is please, if you are a parent, do not underestimate, right, the amount of attention, right?
Oh my gosh. Everything that just happened in the last 10 seconds is exactly why I don't think I want to have kids.
Right. Yeah. It's speaking, so many parents, I'll tell you, so many parents go, oh, kids are amazing. You've got to have them, in this very kind of glazed eye, zombie kind of join us kind of way. And I will tell you, my feeling is, unless you really want to have kids, unless it's an imperative for you personally, don't. The planet has too many people.
Right?
But if it is something that you want to do, you should absolutely have the right to have kids and be supported as a parent and everything, right?
Everybody's got their thing. I'm pretty sure that's not my thing.
Right. It's great to know that.
Yep. Yeah. So how long have you been working at LaunchDarkly then?
So this has been, I've been there for, in September, it'll be 2 years.
Oh, okay. So this is one of the longer ones.
Yeah. Kind of. I think, well, let's see. I would say it's halfway, Okay. I think the longer ones for me are like 3 or 4 years.
3 or 4 years. Okay.
So, but certainly getting there. I have no intentions of leaving. I have a fantastic boss. I have a fantastic team, I really like the organization. I like their values. I like the culture.
Are you guys working completely remote?
At the moment, yes. We're starting. So one thing that happened is that we were all crammed into an office that we were rapidly outgrowing in Oakland. And we got this amazing new office, and on 2 floors. It's beautiful. It's been completely designed for us. It's been painted and it's lovely. And it was due to open a week after the pandemic started, after lockdown started. So it's been sitting there completely, almost totally empty.
Oh my goodness.
You know, the office manager has been there and a couple other people. And now we're starting to let people back in, and it's a beautiful space. But also the company, I'm glad, is being really thoughtful about it and realizing that everybody has different desires and needs.
Do you know how many people work with you
in total?
Yeah,
I think I'm really bad at this, especially because it keeps changing. We're rapidly growing.
Yeah.
So last I checked, it was around 300.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's and we have a lot of people in New York now, a lot in London. We have people on Australia, in Germany, I think. And so, yeah, we have, but London and New York are the main other places we seem to be expanding at the moment. And
you're from London originally, right? Would you ever go back? Work in the London office, perhaps?
Maybe. I don't know. There's aspects of London and Britain, especially right now, that I'm really not keen to be back with. I mean, I miss it. I miss certain aspects of London hugely. And I love it when I do go back. I think there's a certain British cynicism that at times is very helpful and at times really damaging. And so California is in some ways the opposite of that. And that's been really interesting. And really, aspects of it have been really positive. And some of it, I think, obviously, is like, no, you're all living in a dream world.
When did you move here?
In 2006. I mean, okay. I'd lived here, actually. I started living here on and off in like 99. But
what is the tech scene like in London versus like LA, maybe?
I have no idea.
No?
I'm sorry.
I'm wondering, so a while ago, I interviewed Charmini, and she is from Mysterium. She moved from Australia to London for crypto because it was booming in London. And so I was just thinking about like what the tech scene is like in London and whether it's like a big thing that people often move there for, or I don't know.
I think it is. It's kind of, London, unfortunately, unlike America, London has been having this kind of black hole effect on the UK, in that it's just been sucking everything out of the rest of the country, right?
Yeah.
And there have been attempts to build up proper tech hubs in other parts of the country. I know friends of mine who are working in Hull. There's plenty in Brighton. Brighton is one of the few places where there's still a lot of interesting companies. And I'm probably doing a disservice to a bunch of other cities as well. Yeah. And please forgive me, Brits, because I moved away in the mid 2000s, right? So I've been out the country.
It's been a hot min.
Yeah. A decade and a half. And so I cannot comment on, I come back. When I started in tech then, it was part of quite an insular scene, that I was part of a bunch of people who were in a bunch of different companies. And we kind of made our own little tech mafia, as it were, and kind of spread out. There was a friend of mine who's now, he moved over to California around the same time I did. He is now currently international director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Danny O'Brien is his name. And he ran an amazing newsletter back then. He and Dave Green and Lee McGuire ran a great newsletter called NTK, stands for Need to Know. And it was an email newsletter that came out every Friday afternoon. And, and it was a great digest of the tech scene. at the time. And there are things now, I love Today in Tabs by Rusty Foster is a wonderful thing. Dave Pell does an amazing daily newsletter. It's not DaveNet, it's something else, I can't remember what it's called, but Dave Pell. And there are a few of these. I really like seeing the people who have plenty of experience and do these rapid digests and are funny and have and this is one of the advantages of experience, is that you get to see the patterns coming back over and over again. And it's great to be surprised when something breaks out in a way that beats your experience as well.
I'll also just say that you could sign up for the HackerNoon newsletter at hackernoon.com.
Yes.
We have a funny newsletter. We have a funny copywriting team. I like that.
Cool. I confess I have not been signed up for it. I will do that as soon as we're done here. I don't want typing noises on the microphone.
Okay, so I have to confess something to you. I'm not a developer. I don't have a development background. And so as I was learning more about LaunchDarkly and feature flags, I realized this is a new concept for me. So yeah, feature flags I have only just learned about. And so here's what my understanding of them is. And you can let me know if this is correct or not. So I envision it as something that you put into your code when you're wanting to release a new feature. Let's say it could be like a variable, so only a certain set of people get this feature or something like that, like the professional users versus the regular users or something. And so you put this feature flag in that flags that set of code, that's the variable, and that variable or that flag lets the whole thing know that with this set of rules, it should have this feature, right? That's it?
That's a really good explanation.
Oh, yes, actually. Okay.
That's remarkably... It's cool. Kind of... You nailed the key thing there, which is that it's something in your code that acts like a variable. It's a resource that you can read, and it's instant to read. I mean, it's vitally important that it impacts performance as little as possible. And it's, you use it to make any kind of decision in code. So, for example, for the release version, the simplest form, and before we go into what we call targeting, which is how you can have multiple values for different people, depending on who it is or based on rules. Let's just say you're using it as a very simple on-off for everybody. It's still useful. It sounds like the kind of thing. When I first learned about feature flags, I thought this is Booleans as a service. How is this useful? And and excuse me. The great thing about them is, one of the great things is that you can change them without restarting your code, and the code will pick up the change, right? So you don't need to change your code, you don't need to redeploy, restart anything. So it means that you can turn things on and off without needing to change configuration, without needing to, it's a more rapid form of configuration, effectively. You can use it instead of configuration in places. It's not good for holding secrets. Like, you wouldn't put your database connection string in there, but it is really good for, is this feature turned on or not? And so being able to turn on a feature without deployment, right? Because we think of deployment as this big effort where, you're wiping code, restarting things may go on fire, and you'll need to roll back. And we have this very binary, very, huge granularity, I think of it, in terms of what you want in fine-grained control. And when it comes to deployment, it's huge, giant grains, to take that analogy, is that you either get to the new code or the old code. And if the new code failed, you have to go back to the old code. And the new code may have like 20 new changes in it. And if one of them fails, you have to roll everything back, right? And suddenly 19 features that are working fine get completely held up because one of them has a bug, right? So what you want is to be able to turn each one on and off individually, entirely separate from deployment. And this is useful in a bunch of ways. Firstly, it gives you that granularity to be able to say, you know what, even though something's buggy, we can turn it off and we don't need to roll the other stuff back. It means that you can turn these features on one at a time and see how the system reacts. And it means that when you roll the code out and everything is turned off, if the deployment fails, you know it's almost certainly not because of that new code, because it's all turned off, right? So it must be something else. And this is hugely useful when diagnosing things, right? When it comes to remediating failure of a bad deployment, every second counts.
Right.
But also one of the things where it gets really interesting to do, and this is what happens with most software engineering, is the most interesting concepts are the things that change people process, right? It's not just code process, but like which parts of the organization can do things. So when it comes to launching a new feature, normally it's in the DevOps team's hands or operations team's hands, because they're the ones who control release. But if the code is already deployed, then you can give that switch to marketing or to product, right? And say, now it's on your timeline. You can turn it on yourself.
You can do that whenever. You can plan your whole marketing campaign around it. Yeah, okay.
Right. And suddenly, people, if you want something to go out on 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning, it doesn't mean that the whole operations team needs to be, ready to deploy this. You still want to have, if there's a major change to code coming, you still want the developers on hand, but it's a far less of a production, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of thinking, like, wrapping my mind around production and launching new features. I think that in the past, for companies that I've worked with, when I used to work for like a software company, and the software company would roll out the new code quarterly, and so essentially is what they were doing, taking the base from the previous quarter, creating a new variable, coding in all of the features into that variable, and then trying to launch. But then there's multiple features within the same variable. So something like a feature flag would be able to tell me to single out each individual feature so that I know what happens if there's bugs or if something goes wrong. Okay. Got it.
Exactly. And then, you get into things like, firstly, that flags don't have to be Booleans. They can be any kind of value. You can have multivariate flags.
Right.
So you could have like a text message in there. If there's like the hello greeting, right? Then you can say, okay, we want to change the greeting. It's going to read it from this feature flag. Yeah. And the good thing is that anybody can update that feature flag without needing to redeploy or restart code. So it can be marketing or copy or content team or whoever that changes that. But then you get into things, as you said, you can have different values for different people based on rules. And the power there is amazing, because those rules do not need to be in your code. And when you realize that you can completely change how something works for different kinds of people or different kinds of users or different contexts, without needing to change the code or to put that logic in the code, then it becomes amazing. So there's one example that I love, which is what's called testing in production. And this gets hugely misunderstood by developers. The idea that you do testing in production, some people think, well, we're not doing any testing in staging. We're just throwing code out there untested and testing it. It doesn't mean that, right? What it means, firstly, as we like to say, you're always testing in production, whether you admit it or not, right? You're always putting code in production that may have bugs, and you have to roll it back because there are bugs. But what you can do, normally the way you do testing, and you may have seen this, is that you have a staging environment, right? So you put the code in the staging environment, and the QA team or whoever it is that's testing, include the developers themselves, does the tests in the staging environment. And then once you're happy, you roll it out to production. Now, the trouble is that staging is never the same as production. You put a huge amount of effort into making staging the same as close as it can be to production, but it is never production. And that is why plenty of code fails as soon as it's deployed to production, because there's some core difference. And so what you can do is you can deploy code to production that is turned off. And then you turn it on, but only for the people in the QA team or the people internal staff. Right. So you can say, right, so this is only available for use by our team who is testing it. And they're literally testing it in the production environment but it's not released. So the difference is it's deployed, but so we tend to think of deploy and release as the same thing. Deploy is when you put the code out there on the server. Yep. Release is when it's available for everybody to use. And usually those are the same things. But if you separate deploy from release, you say we put the code out there. But release is a much more gradual thing.
So with this, you put the code in already in deployment, and then it remains dormant, and then you can flip the features on one at a time, and thus also making sure that it works in production and works all together.
Yeah, so and you can.
Then why do people not do this? Like, is there a situation where this doesn't make sense?
There are some situations where it doesn't work very well, I think, but not many. We keep finding, I think, that there are cases where you can't really use it because the systems won't allow it, right? You can't feature flag certain kinds of systems because you can't put custom code in them, right? So when you're building out certain kinds of infrastructure, or like the configuration for that infrastructure needs to be controlled in a different way. And there are things you can do to attach events to feature flags. So you can say, when I flip this feature flag, also trigger this script that goes and does this thing to the infrastructure or something like that. And you can even have things the other way around. There's a wonderful trick you can do. This is something we call flag triggers or circuit breakers, which is that you can, so you have like a monitoring system or something that is watching, making sure your code is well behaved. And what you will do is you'll set normal, your normal MO is to put thresholds on it. So if something starts going really bad, like if page load starts taking longer than a second, or if your CPU percentage goes above 95, something like that, then it should start triggering alerts, right? And wake people up, right? What you can do is have these alerts flip feature flags as well. And this is really useful in situations like Black Friday, right? Or unexpected traffic floods. So sometimes, let's say you've got an e-commerce site and you've got product pages, and the products also have comments and reviews on them, right? And that's something that may take a lot of database work in the creation of the page, right? But it's extra database work to put those reviews there. But the reviews are not the most valuable thing, right? The most valuable thing is that you can see the product and buy the product. That's your priority. So if your site goes under intense load and suddenly all these reviews and comments are generating a whole load of extra database load, you can shed that load by, saying, right, we have a permanent feature flag that turns off reviews and comments, right? It won't show them in the page anymore. And it's something to reach for when you need to keep the site stable. So it gives you a easy set of things that you can do in times of heavy load to very rapidly change running code without having to restart it, without having to redeploy.
Okay, but I want to go back to a question that is, why do people not use this? Like, why is this not so widely adopted that everybody has feature flags of some sort?
I think in many ways it's quite a new idea, and which is interesting because it's a really simple one. But often it's the simple ideas, especially in software engineering, that there are certain things, certain kinds of, I think, kind of like dogma, certain taboos that we have, and things keep changing about what's okay and what isn't. And one of them, for example, is the tension between, test everything as thoroughly as possible before release, or just continually release, continually deploy, and then make fixes. And it depends entirely on the kind of business you're in. And I think feature flags help you move more towards the continuous deployment, which most people actually want to do. So by giving you that extra control, it's still, it's a kind of thinking. I think, honestly, one of the reasons why it hasn't been picked up as much is because the idea is so weirdly simple, it's almost insulting. That was certainly part of what hit me when I first saw it. Is, as I said, Booleans as a service, really? Because you don't see the benefits until you look at the process improvements, until you look at how it changes how the organization works together.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because I'm going to be honest with you. I was chatting with my developer before this, and I call him my dev mind. His name is Richard. He's been on the podcast. Hi, Richard. And he helps me to understand some of these things and pick apart the IT speak, I guess.
Right.
And one of the things he was saying was, I don't really understand why I would use this as opposed to using a branch and just using different URLs when they release new features. Because he didn't immediately see the value as well. So that's why I'm thinking like, just wondering about why people don't adopt this massively.
And the thing is that we still use branching occasionally in LaunchDark. I mean, we do the pull request model in internal development still. We do branching. We do set up separate URLs for checking things. Though feature flags is a good thing to have on top of that. I think it's the kind of thing that becomes more important the more change you have, the more development you have, the more people you have working together. And you see that with a lot of software engineering practices, right? There's a lot of them that don't seem to be that valuable until the scale of things that you're doing, and especially the number of engineers you have, the amount of work that's happening every day, the number of changes that are going to the code base, until those start scaling up, suddenly these things become a lot more important and the value becomes a lot more apparent.
Yes.
I mean, but even so, as a developer, even if you're a single developer, something I love for mobile development is being able to use feature flags in mobile apps. And the trouble with mobile apps is that you can't just deploy a new version that instantly updates everything, right? You've got to wait for people out there to update their apps. And sometimes some users stay on an old version of an app for years, right? And you need the ability to say, right, I want to turn this off for this versions of the app on this platform or on this hardware profile is incredibly useful without needing to change, push new code, because you can't. But it's, I think, sorry, to come back to the key question, I think part of it is that it is a relatively, in the history of things, it's a relatively new technique. LaunchDarkly is the first company, I believe, to actually do feature flags as a service. And it was founded in 2014.
So pretty new. That's 7 years ago now. Yeah.
And so loads of companies, I think that loads of companies have built their own internal feature flagging systems. A lot of them, unfortunately, they then realize why this is something that is better handled in a dedicated system that you may want to pay somebody else for. And there's good open source. I actually did a big blog post on LaunchDarkly about build versus buy, right? In terms of, do you want to build your own? Do you want to use an open source one? Do you want to buy one? And personally, I would say never build your own. There's plenty of good open source ones. If you want to start, there are great open source ones out there, and it's a much better idea than building your own. I think that LaunchDarkly is better than the open source version. Yeah. But if you were saying, look, I'm not going to pay for it yet, I would say there are good open source ones. Use one of those. Start with that. Yeah. Because I think it's because people underestimate how difficult it is to do well.
Yeah.
That they just think
it just seems like such a powerful tool to help your productivity. So yeah.
It's something that everybody underestimates how it works and what it needs to be able to do. And so I think I can just add a database table and put some Booleans in there and I'm done. And it's like, no, you're not.
For you, as someone who has been on so many projects, why are you staying at LaunchDarkly? What makes it special to you?
I think ultimately the people is, but also I think, so that's my own personal reason is that having been through a whole bunch of different things, different companies, I love the people who I work with. I think they are fantastic.
It makes a huge difference.
It makes all the difference. The worst thing, I've been working on systems that I passionately believed in, but I could not get along with the people, and ultimately it was really a bad thing overall. And it's bad for your mental health. It's bad for stress. I think that LaunchDarkly is to me, it's clear that it's the market leader in this particular space. I mean, I work there, obviously I would say that. But I think also it's a really interesting area. If you're interested in software engineering and the future of software engineering, finding these, it's interesting. It's like, an analogy, feature flag as an analogy for itself. It's a small switch that makes a big difference. And, it's the literal meaning of the word leverage. You want the philosopher who said, with a sturdy enough space and a long enough lever, I could lift the world. And I think LaunchDarkly is in a place to make a big change to software engineering with some relatively simple starts that end up, affecting things in a big way. I think that for me, the philosophy of it, we talked about this a little earlier, but as an engineer, as you get a more experienced engineer, you go from being frustrated that something doesn't work to being amazed that anything works at all. Because software is so horrifically complicated. And it worries me, right? It worries me that we have this overcomplicated pack of, house of cards that we are building everything on and continually adding new flaws to, that is more complex than we can comprehend. And so it becomes more and more important to have an off switch, right? Have off switches for very simple controls over things so that you can get your hugely complicated system back under control again. And to me, that I think is an increasingly important thing to have in the world.
All right. Well, Yoz, thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Amy. This has been brilliant.
I learned a lot about feature flags that I didn't know before, so I thank you for that. And where can we find you and your work online?
So on Twitter, I am at Yoz, Y-O-Z, or Y-O-Z if you're a Brit, because God, it's terrible. I still half and half when talking to Americans.
Or Canadian or American.
Canadians, thank you, or Australians, or etc. But yes, Y-O-Z on Twitter. LaunchDarkly.com, one word. I have also a few videos that explain simple aspects or multiple aspects of feature flagging. You can go to LaunchDarkly's YouTube channel to see those, or you can go to launchdarkly.com/onboarding is a place where we keep a bunch of videos to explain aspects of feature flagging.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Yoz.
Thank you, Amy.
If you like this episode of the HackerNoon podcast, subscribe, like it, share it, do all the things. And this episode was edited by audio wizard Alex and hosted by me, Amy Tom, and produced by HackerNoon. Stay weird, and I'll see you on the internet.